Hi, everyone. Welcome or welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get started with our next round of presentations. Our next presentation will be on UNC-Chapel Hill's three-phased implementation of ArchiveSpace. Dawne Lucas from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill will be presenting. In this presentation, Dawne will explore the three phases that UNC-Chapel Hill is taking in implementation, why they chose to implement in this order, how they migrated locations before migrating the finding aids, and the pros and cons they've encountered along the way. She will also share future plans for migrating finding aids. Dawne Howard Lucas is a technical services archivist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Wilson Special Collections Library, where she is part of the ArchivesSpace Implementation team. Before moving to Wilson Library in 2018, she was the Special Collections Librarian at UNC's Health Sciences Library and the head of technical services at the Duke University Medical Center Archives, implementing Archivists Toolkit at both institutions. She's an active member of the Society of American Archivists, the Society of North Carolina Archivists, and Librarians, Archivists, and Museum Professionals in the history of the health sciences. Dawne has lived her entire life in Southern Virginia and North Carolina's Research Triangle region. She loves reading and watching sports, especially Tar Heel basketball. Welcome, Dawne.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. So good afternoon. As has already been stated, I am Dawne Howard Lucas, and I'm a technical services archivist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Wilson Special Collections Library. And if you were wondering, you see the 4 libraries at the bottom of the screen. It is the second one with the dome. So I'm excited to talk to you about our recent and most definitely ongoing ArchivesSpace implementation. So, I need to advance my slide. Okay, so first I want to give you a very quick overview of Wilson Library, just so you understand the scale of our organization. I know we have people from organizations of various sizes here today. We have 5 different collecting units at Wilson Library: the North Carolina Collection, the Southern Historical Collection, the Southern Folklife Collection, the Rare Book Collection, and University Archives and Records Management Services. About 50 full-time employees, student workers, and we have more than 10,000 accession records and more than 7,000 archives and manuscript collections. Since we're trying to break down the silos that exist between these 5 collecting units, all of the information in ArchivesSpace is part of one repository profile instead of 5 different repository profiles. We have 3 main IT staff members working on implementation with a larger ArchivesSpace implementation team of additional IT staff and archivists. So a little bit about our collection management history. Before 2011, our accessions information was tracked in a Microsoft Access database. Information from that database was imported into Archivists Toolkit in 2011, and then we used Archivists Toolkit from 2011 until October 2019, pretty much for accessions information only. We didn't use the other Archivists Toolkit modules in any sort of consistent or robust way, and then in October of 2019, we began using ArchivesSpace to record and track accessions information, much in the same way as we had been in Archivists Toolkit. When we were using Archivists Toolkit, we did create stub resource records to link to the accession records, but we never used Archivists Toolkit to generate finding aids. We create finding aids still now using EAD templates in NoteTab and Oxygen, and we manage version control via GitLab. So here's a really basic version of our implementation plan: accessions, then locations, and then finding aids. And we realized that implementing ArchivesSpace as a locations database before we've ingested our finding aids is a bit backwards and leads some people to ask, why would you do that? So let me take a few moments to explain that thinking. We began with accessions because they were the low-hanging fruit. The ingest was relatively easy, and it was rather a low risk of a major workflow disruption. And then we decided to tackle locations next because they were kind of like the mid-level fruit, and it enabled us to go ahead and move out of a very rickety Microsoft Access database. We knew that migrating the finding aids would be a much longer and involved process, and we thought it was important to go ahead and move the locations information instead of waiting to figure out the finding aids part, despite knowing that much of this work will probably need to be redone when we get to phase 3 with the finding aids. We did have some debate about holding off on locations until we were ready to ingest the finding aids, but we know that ingesting the finding aids is just going to be so involved. We have more than 7,000 hand-coded finding aids, and whereas they are coded really well, they're also coded in a way that is not entirely compatible with ArchivesSpace. So let's go back to phase 1. Importing accession records. We did the final data migration from Archivists Toolkit to ArchivesSpace this past October, as I mentioned, and it was a relatively painless process, although we pretty quickly realized that we needed enhanced browse and search capabilities. One of our developers, Christina Cortland, created a plugin for local customizations, including the display of the processing status and extent fields on the browse screen. Not being able to see the processing status information on the browse screen was by far the #1 complaint that we received when we launched. And we also added an existing plugin in order to have more advanced search options. And Christina also created a drop-down for the first component of our unique identifier, and it also auto-generates the second part of the identifier based on the date. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So here's an example of the plugins that we've added. So you can see in that oval, the processing status and the extent fields, which doesn't appear on this browse screen just out of the box. And then the arrows towards the top are pointing at some of the enhanced search options that don't come out of the box. And then here you can see modifications made for creating identifiers. So that first box has a drop menu, and from that menu you can select one of those 5 collecting units that we have. And the second part will auto-generate based on the date, and then you have the dot and the pound sign, and so it's just going to go in sequential order. So if you have 5 accessions on one day, the first one will be .1, the second .2, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now going on to phase 2. So that was to import all of our locations information from our Microsoft Access Locations database into ArchivesSpace. And for several reasons, this was more difficult than importing the accessions information. So with accessions, there was already an established Lyrasis migration tool that we could use to migrate that data from Archivists Toolkit to ArchivesSpace. While with locations, we had to write our own scripts to go from the Microsoft Access database to ArchivesSpace. Additionally, the data in Archivists Toolkit is formatted in a way that is more consistent and more compatible for ingest into ArchivesSpace versus the Access database, which allowed almost free-form text that involved a lot of data cleanup beforehand. When we were all still on campus, select research room staff used our test instance and gave a thumbs up to proceed into production. Since we haven't been on campus since then, no one is using it for paging, but that's actually kind of been good. This has given us a chance to implement it, do data cleanup, and train staff without disrupting research room workflows. Our research room staff have read-only access to ArchivesSpace, so they can use this for paging purposes. And this is a really huge improvement over the Access database, which was really easy to accidentally edit and then could be hard to fix. So Here's an example of our locations browse screen. So you can see we have 28,238 location records, and we have a lot of locations and instances, and how we have recorded and presented this information has changed over time. So for example, we used to record locations at the folder level, and now we record locations at the box level. So for example, in this finding aid, you see a folder list with no corresponding box information. So if someone requests folder 2, research room staff has to look up which box it's in. And now in this case, it might be safe to assume that folder 2 is in box 1, but then you encounter things like this, and there's just no way that you're going to know which box folder 2186 is in without looking it up. So how we've addressed this, since we haven't ingested the full finding aids yet, right now our strategy is to add the top containers to those stub resource records that I mentioned earlier and record folder ranges when present. So you see here document case 1 has folders 1 through 32. And then when you click on that document case 1, you can see the location for paging. So phase 3, we'll be importing our finding aids and implementing a public user interface. At this point, we're not sure if we're going to use the ArchivesSpace public user interface or if we're going to implement ArcLight. Since we've been hand coding finding aids using more or less the same procedure for more than 20 years, this is going to be a major workflow shift. And we anticipate that there will be a lot of necessary legacy data cleanup, and we also need to determine the best way to display our digital content. So here's an example of a finding aid with digital content linked from it. So then you get this close-up of folder 1. When researchers click on that folder, it brings up an expanded view of all the scans in the folder. But the magic that makes this all happen, not surprisingly probably, does not import into ArchivesSpace. And so we really need to discuss a strategy for importing this type of data and how we want our digitized content to display going forward. So it was really nice to hear strategies from some other people during the digital asset management breakout session earlier this afternoon. So going back to this slide, we do know that we want ArchivesSpace to communicate with Aon. Ideally, we would like the location information to print on the call slips without having to look it up manually using the procedure I just showed you. That would really make all of our lives so much easier. But in order to make this happen, we need to change how we present container information in many of our finding aids so that researchers can request materials as a pageable unit, basically, so at the box level instead of the folder level. And as mentioned earlier, we haven't yet decided if we're going to use the out-of-the-box public user interface or ArcLight, but I think we'd probably be making that decision sometime pretty soon. And then that is what I have for right now. Please feel free to contact me if you have questions or words of wisdom. And I think we now have several minutes for Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Dawne. That was great. So yeah, we have about 5 minutes for Q&A, and we already have a question in the chat. But yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your questions or type them in the chat. A question from Anne: would it be possible for you to share that script for adding container locations into ArchivesSpace in bulk?
Yes. I think we have shared it. But if we haven't, we can share that on the ArchivesSpace website.
Yeah, is it potentially on the awesome ArchivesSpace list?
I think so, but if that's not the case, we can add it.
Thanks. Yeah. All right. You may have said this and I just missed it, but had you already converted your pre-2011 MS Access data over to Archivists Toolkit, or did you have to migrate them both to ArchiveSpace?
We had migrated the MS Access. So for accessions records, we had migrated from Access to Archivist Toolkit before coming into ArchiveSpace. The locations information was in a separate Access database, and that went straight from Access into ArchiveSpace without any intermediary step.
All right. Are users, or how are users able to search for material from a single collecting unit if all collections are in a single repository?
So that is something that we're going to have to work out. So we don't have, the public user interface available right now. Right now, our users are just accessing our finding aids as they would usually do, which actually is also not being able to search by a single collecting unit. You can search, like there's a customized Google search on our website that will search our finding aids. So that isn't restricting by unit either. We do think it might be beneficial for people to be able to do that. Maybe not. There is a lot of overlap of content between those collecting units. Whereas it might be beneficial to just be able to search by the Southern Historical Collection, for instance, you might also be limiting yourself if there's overlap of your topic between, say, the Southern Historical Collection and the North Carolina Collection. And that's a pretty common thing that happens at Wilson.
Thanks. Another question, is the plugin for adding processing status / extent in a session browse publicly available, like on GitHub?
Like I said, I think that is available on, was it our awesome ArchiveSpace? But I'll double check and we'll put it there if it's not there. I don't know if it is publicly available on something like GitHub, but I can find out.
To add to your to-do list, Melanie says, I'm interested in the auto-generate feature for unique IDs.
All right, we can share that all together.
Another question, did you have a lot of data cleanup after importing your location data? And if so, what do you wish you would have done pre-import?
So we did a lot of the cleanup pre-import. We kind of took a look at what the issues were and what would be easier to fix pre-import and what would be easier to fix afterwards. For the most part, I think we got it. We did it well. So I don't think there were really any regrets of, oh, I wish we had done this beforehand, or, oh, maybe we should have waited to do this. One of the major things, one of the major issues, as I mentioned, in the Access database, there was just really that ability to enter, free-form text. So there were a lot of spelling discrepancies. So for instance, the word image. So we had image boxes, image folders, oversized image folders. And the word image had been spelled probably 6 different ways, believe it or not. And even the word folder, like it could be misspelled as F-O-D-L-E-R. And so in some cases, it was just easier, just import it into ArchiveSpace, and then you can just merge those together instead of trying to go through the Access database and fix them and risk, solving one problem, but creating another problem in the Access database just because it's really easy to mess up the data in there.
Thanks. So you have one more question. We are at time, so I'm going to read that question. And then if there are any other follow-up questions for Dawne, hopefully she is happy to answer those in the chat because I'm volunteering her for that. And we'll move
Sure.
on to our next presenters. But were you using ranges for indicators? How does that appear for the end user? We tried to use ranges for finding aids, but it didn't translate to ArcLight.
We are, if you're talking about like folder ranges, like, folders 1 through 32, like I showed, we are at the moment, but that is potentially an issue moving forward when we try to implement finding aids. So that is something that we went ahead and did because that was how the data was displayed in the Access database. So we just went ahead and put it in the ArchivesSpace, knowing that we might have to change things going forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dawne. Like I said, we're going to go ahead and move to our next round of presenters. But if you have any other questions for Dawne, please feel free to drop them in the chat or contact her at the email address provided.